to 2 hours. We've added an additional meeting to the calendar for September 22nd. And in October, we've also added 2 additional meetings on the wide-ranging topic of investigations. We've also decided, with your great input, to move presentations to our pre-planning materials. Presenters will record materials for their presentations, then we will be able to consume those individually, and then we'll come together as a working group along with the presenter, where we can ask questions and have robust discussions on those topic areas. And so with that, I have asked Jeff Welty, who's been our great substantive lead from the Attorney General's office, to go over our process for synthesizing the issues to be addressed for Work Group 2, our discussions, and our pathway forward to recommendations. I do note that for consistency, we'll utilize a recommended template, which will hopefully serve as a guide where feasible for our work. And so, Jeff, I'd like to turn it over to you to go over our process, and I call it process improvement because I think this will lead us on a great pathway forward on some very meaty topics. Jeff?
Okay, thank you, Secretary Hooks. And yeah, we've heard loud and clear from the members of the working group that there's a desire to have more time for conversation, discussion, and exchange of views. And I think everybody from the very beginning of getting this work group together has recognized that we have a large number of very, very substantial issues to look at. And we also have a large number of members of the working group who come from really different backgrounds and perspectives. And so it's been a challenge from the get-go to figure out how to have a process that provides enough information that it feels like it's well-researched and detailed and credible, and also allows enough discussion that it feels like there's a genuine exchange of views and opportunity for consensus. So in consultation with the co-chairs and other members of the staff support team and Secretary Hooks, we've come up with what we hope will be a process that will allow the group to have ample discussion, that will still allow us to present a lot of information to the group to be grist for that discussion, and then will allow us to have discussion that reaches some outcomes, in other words, some specific recommendations. So you've got a document that was attached to your email for this meeting entitled Process Outline, and that kind of lays out generally what our approach is going to be. We are going to, Secretary Hooks mentioned, attempt to get our speakers to pre-record their remarks, and we'll send those to you in advance. You can watch those and do additional readings and research prior to the meeting, and then at the meeting, we'll try to bring the speakers in so that they can answer any questions that you may have or engage in discussion with you. That'll reserve most of each meeting for the work group really to process and discuss amongst itself. Secretary Hooks will lead that conversation and try to draw folks out on questions like, what's the real problem here? Where are we headed? What recommendations can we identify based on what our presenters and readings have given us? And we hope that that discussion will fit into the amount of time that we have on our expanded agendas with the longer meetings. Hopefully at the conclusion of that discussion, Secretary Hooks will be able to identify the recommendations that have the strongest initial support within the group, and he'll ask us as staff to attempt to draft language around those recommendations for the group to consider. We'll do that drafting after the meeting, and we will send those drafts out in advance of the next meeting, so that at the subsequent meeting, the group can look at the specific language that's used, can look at the menu of recommendations that have been made, and have some input on, does that look right? Does it reflect the will of the group? Are there other ideas that the group should consider? And we'll do our best to incorporate changes or make additions in real time. And as we're doing that, Secretary Hooks will be assessing the kind of the temperature of the group and the amount of consensus that there is. And ultimately, we hope to reach consensus on recommendations, but If we reach the end of the time for discussion and there's still some division, once everyone's been heard, then we'll vote on the recommendations, and ultimately a majority will determine whether a particular recommendation is included and should go forward to the full task force. So we'll sort of rinse and repeat that process for each meeting with pre-work, general discussion, drafting of recommendations, and then at the next meeting, discussion and fine tuning of recommendations. And we'll, according to the work plan that we've set up, we'll try to get through that process for each of our topic areas. The one last thing that I'll add is that if you've looked at the revised work plan, you'll see that the topic of investigations we've pushed to October. And partly that's because that topic is so broad and so encompassing, could mean a lot of different things. And as we've been digging into it, we just think it's so substantial that it's going to take us really a couple of meetings to dig into the most important parts of that. And so in order to allow sufficient time for the other topics, we're going to work through those first, more or less one per meeting. And then when we get to investigations, that'll be in October, and we'll devote 2 meetings to that. Some of you may be thinking, but wait, are our recommendations due to the task force in early October? Yes. However, in consultation with the co-chairs and the staff leads, it's clear to us that it's okay if we tackle some of our issues even in October, and that the recommendations we submit in early October can still be supplemented or added to based on the work that we do in October. So that's the overall game plan and the timetable. I hope that it's responsive to what folks are wanting, and I hope that it enables us to tackle all these very, very important and substantial issues adequately. Greg or anybody who was involved in developing this process, if I missed anything or said something wrong, please jump in and correct me, but I think that's the overview.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Does anyone have any questions of Jeff Welty concerning the process as he has laid it out before we move forward?
I think that makes good sense, and I appreciate the work of staff to find a way where we can have more time to discuss and also have the information up front so we have something to discuss meaningfully. So I know it's probably a lot of work on your part to figure that out, so thank you.
I echo the chief's sentiment. Staff has worked extremely hard on this, and so I'm extremely grateful to this. And Jeff is a very accomplished attorney, and he's will also serve to guide me to keep me on track through this process too. And so I thank him and Greg and Jasmine and all of those, Pam in my shop, that have worked so hard on getting this together for us. Does anybody else have any comments or questions for Jeff about the process itself before we move on into our agenda?
Just thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll just go ahead and move forward, and we'll keep making great use of our time. Fortunate for us, at least today's meeting, we have already gone through phase 1 that's put forth in our process outline as explained by Jeff, and you all have already received some materials on that where the presenters have gone and we've had some discussions. And now we're going to have some more focused discussions on 2 particular areas. And the idea is to lay out a foundation, hopefully thought-provoking, hopefully discussion issues that will engage everyone to come to the table with their thoughts and ideas to move us forward. I want everybody to be mindful of the fact that we do have some time constraints, and that the best way to work collaboratively is to acknowledge each other as individuals and embrace the idea of being open-minded as we approach our work. And we're also live into the public, as we should be, in a large degree of transparency through this process. I'm going to go ahead and dive in with the use of force. We have had some very good discussions as recorded by our previous meetings on use of force, and and I'll just talk a little bit about some of those things that have come up during the meeting. Is that there is no uniform definition of use of force, and therefore there hasn't been a consistent mandate of requiring the collection of use of force data either at the state or federal level. There's been discussions about internal affairs and investigatory processes are often, viewed to be cloaked in secrecy, and that there's a lack of trust in communities. That there is no uniform requirement for sentinel event reviews, and that sometimes there may be concerns, or oftentimes may be concerns by some individuals that they don't see improvements coming out of a review of use of force events. We also took surveys, if you'll recall, in some of our earlier work group meeting, and they focused on a number of areas with use of force. One, requiring law enforcement agencies to collect uniform data on uses of force and submit that data to a state or federal repository. I'm going to talk a little bit long on this front end, and then I am going to step back and allow the discussions to flow forward and try to facilitate these. But I want to kind of refresh people's recollection, kind of where we're at and also as an editorial note, I would suggest that that we engage partners at the Division of Criminal Information Identification section of the SBI, as well as federal partners, because they already have experience in collecting traffic stop data and national incident-based repository data, so that all data is compliant moving forward should we adopt a recommendation coming from there. A second item that we talked about, and it was in our survey, was encouraging or requiring officers to issue a warning when feasible before using deadly force. We also talked that this comports with current case law under Tennessee versus Garner, and there may be other cases, and Jeff and the other attorneys may be able to bring forward some additional ideas in that area. Number three, encouraging or requiring law enforcement agencies to conduct sentinel event reviews when deadly force is used. We've had discussions about who and where that should be conducted. Number four, prohibiting officers from using deadly force against suspects who pose a risk or who do not pose a risk or of death or serious injury to others, but only to themselves, such as in a suicidal event or episodes. So those are the areas that I took note of without going on and on about every detail of it. I will let you rely on your own recollections. And I want to kind of first open the door based on hopefully my refreshing your recollection, and then facilitating the discussions in several meaningful ways, I hope. From the discussions and the refresher that we've had today, I would like to start the discussion by asking, what do you all hear as the problem statement? And you have some of this information available to you already, but don't feel like you have to hit every point. What did you hear as our vision for a future state? What recommendations did you hear through our discussions and things that should guide you in this? And I'm letting you know this on the front end because I think that it will always keep us on a pathway forward. What recommendations are packaged or all ready for us that out there that we may want to vote on or may need to be modified? And then what other potential recommendations should be discussed? We do have somebody trying to keep up with us in real time with some of the information, and they're putting it on a Word doc for us to help guide us in case you get lost in the discussion as well. And so these are kind of the guiding principles by which I would like to open the floor for comment. And so I may need some help if I don't know about Zoom as far as a raise the hand feature. So if you just want to go ahead and I'll try my best to recognize individuals. If you would say your name and then discuss as you deem appropriate.
I'll get started, Secretary Hooks, if you don't mind, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the things we have to address first before we can really get our direction going is this standardized definition of what exactly a use of force consists of, or what we're expecting to be reported. If we're in the process of wanting or mandating data collection, I think it's only fair that we all, we compare the apples to the apples. And what I mean by that is that some agencies and some departments will consider one thing a use of force when another agency won't. And I know we've probably said that a number of times, but I think it bears repeating, and it is very important that we come up with a standardized understanding of what this data collection is expecting to be reported, or how it's expected to be reported. And without the standardized definition of the use of force and what essentially would be what the state would recognize as a use of force, I think we would be skewing the numbers and leaving it to individual departments to kind of decide what they want to report and what they don't want to report as it relates to use of force and use of force data collection. So I think our number one goal would be to come up with some type of standardized definition as it relates to the use of force and what it is we're expecting to be reported.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your input. Does anyone have anything else or would like to comment on Sergeant Garton's information that he's presented to the group?
I'll build on that a little bit if I may, sir.
Yes, sir.
I agree 100%. We need a standardized definition so we can compare what is a use of force versus what isn't. And as we've discussed quite a bit, that there is no standardization, at least in general. The FBI does have somewhat of a definition, at least in what they categorize in their data process for trying to collect use of force data on a nationwide basis. So that's a good place to start. I think we need to go beyond that because that is mainly related to deadly force, and we probably want to capture more than that. But a lot of the groundwork has already been laid, and anything that we can agree on in North Carolina, I think should be in concert with the FBI's database so that we can seamlessly report to that portal as well. It's fairly simple, which is important as well. We need to develop a system that works with the records management systems that are in place across the state, at least the major ones, and there's only about a half a dozen, give or take. And the more we can automate or make a submission easy, like we do with NIBRS and previously did with UCR, that will help making sure that we get the information reported in a timely basis. So there's some technology around that is going to be helpful as well. But what a use of force is, I think, is probably going to be a little more difficult to discern, and because there are so many different opinions of that. And whenever that is decided and agreed to, there has to be some training. There has to be some update of lesson plans at the Justice Academy. There has to be some training at BLET. All those kind of things that will grow from that standardized definition.
Thank you, Chief.
Yeah, this is Kerwin Pittman. Good evening, everybody. I agree with both of the gentlemen that spoke before me. We definitely need to hammer out a concrete definition of what use of force is, because it can be a word or a phrase, so to speak, that is played upon, in which agencies can feel the need to submit or feel not the need, to submit, as well as to come up with a full plan to stabilize and uplift the use of force policy that we put in place, meaning like come up with all the entities in which will be needed, supportive entities that will be needed to make sure that this recommendation is carried out, thinking long term, as well as I was thinking when I looked at the recommendation, will this repository be eligible for the community to access? Who would have access to this? So just different things of that nature we may need to think forward moving in especially into this recommendation, because this particular seed is going to grow into a tree and spur off a lot of different branches that we really need to make sure that each one of them is concrete, so we do not have anyone playing any type of word semantics or any type of level, and that it is clear and concise. So I agree wholeheartedly with what the two gentlemen before me said.
Thank you, Mr. Pittman. Your concerns are well founded. I will tell you that even in my own law enforcement journey, it has taken years and years to try to get gang uniform compliance about standardization for reporting of criminal violations, and that has been challenging and ongoing work that's been going on for decades, because you may on the criminal justice end or response end, that there may be one entity that reports something as a fight when it may have indeed been domestic violence, and another jurisdiction reporting it as a call for service. And so we have to be very intentional about how we move forward in with the definition of the use of force, whether that's first agreed upon with the law enforcement agencies and community, whether that's a statutory definition, and that kind of goes back to the chief's point that we have to have data that is consistent, that it can be applied, because it's part of a national discussion as well. And on the uniform crime reporting, they refer to it as NIBRS compliant, National Incident Based Reporting Systems compliant, that utilize existing technology and uniform definitions for consistency. I would invite anyone else to give us your take, either on the definition, or if you have beyond the definition to, what do you hear as the problem statement, and what is our vision for the future of the state, or any other related area as we move through our process.
Secretary Hooks, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I feel that everything that's been said, I just will agree with that. And I would like to show y'all, if your screen will show, that the first day Donnie Williams was made police chief, when I walked into his office, he presented me with a use of force policy that is on the web page for the Wilmington Police Department. Transparency. I'm very concerned that multiple hundreds of different law enforcement agencies have different guidelines, because if you want to graduate from school in North Carolina, you got to follow the Department of Public Instruction. So I hope that somehow people will follow the Department of Public Safety and this recommendation, so that we will be uniform and not one thing and another, because that's what I hear all of you in law enforcement telling us right now. So my vision is that it will be transparent, the numbers will be there that will show, and there will be a singular definition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your insight. Anyone else, feel free to step forward and give us your views on where we're at.
Secretary Hooks, this is Jeff Welty. I just wanted to provide a little information about different definitions and then try to get a sense of which direction the group is wanting to go. I think Chief Letney mentioned the FBI has a voluntary database for certain law enforcement uses of force. And as he said, that really focuses on the discharge of a firearm or uses of force that cause serious bodily injury as defined in federal law. So it's a fairly small slice of use of force, although obviously a very significant slice. So one option would be to go in the direction of that, not trying to define every use of force, but trying to define the most significant ones that the group's concerned about, or perhaps build on that definition. An alternative would be to try to have a standardized definition of use of force that would trigger reporting every time force is used. And we've collected a large number of agency policies which have slightly different ways of putting it, but often define use of force as something like physical contact beyond mere restraint used to overcome resistance or aggression. That's probably about the most common wording that we have. It's vague in itself because what does beyond mere restraint mean? What is mere restraint? But we might be able to build on something like that. I'd be interested in the group's thoughts about that, and also in the question of, are we just looking for a definition of use of force, or perhaps, to Ms. Maxwell's point, is there an interest in something like a model use of force policy that would be available for agencies to consider? That's a bigger lift, but might be more comprehensive. So I just provide that information and ask those questions in the hopes it advances the discussion.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir, Chief.
I think I mentioned in one of our previous meetings, there is a national consensus use of force policy that is a good place to start. It is not designed to be a plug and play. It's designed for an agency to look at and adapt to their state laws, as well as what their expectations for their community are. So a lot of work went into that. It was recently updated. It first came out 2017, recently updated in 2020, just a couple months ago. So again, a great place to start. But I think we also have to be careful and understand that law enforcement engagements are often very dynamic, very challenging, and they don't always fit a nice, neat little box. So if our policy, if our definitions are too tight, we are going to find other problems that we're not anticipating. So one of the reasons policies are written in a sense generically is that it allows more to be included under that umbrella. And then good training, good supervision, good accountability, good judgment would hopefully allow supervisors to look at a situation and opt in rather than out and say, yeah, that kind of fits. When it's too tight a box, it's too easy to say, no, that doesn't fit this specific definition. Rather than, if it can go either way, then yes, it is, and yes, we will report, and yes, we will investigate.
Anyone else have anything in companion or counter to the chief's information?
Yeah, this is Kerwin again. And just thinking about what the chief just said, I would like to kind of see a blanket, so to speak, definition of use of force, because he said a lot with what he just said. If it is too clear and cut and dry, this would allow for some agencies to say, well, this doesn't fit into this box when it might actually does fit into this box. So by creating a kind of a generic blanket, so to speak, this would allow for us to cover a broader area for individuals to say, okay, well, it does fit into this box and we can't opt out of it not fitting into this box, so to speak. So I agree with what he said, but it definitely needs, even though it's a generic and a blanket statement, it definitely needs clear direction as to what guidelines. And another thing I was thinking of, so what will be the repercussions for an agency that doesn't utilize this recommendation? So if I know that if it's no repercussions, so to speak, then then it's more amped for an agency to say, well, I'm just not even going to listen to the recommendation at all, or I don't have to listen to it. And so that may be one of the things we may want to consider as well, putting it to some type of recommendation, be it if we have to get it from legislative perspective or just recommendation perspective.
Correct. Sheriff, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add in that area?
I'm looking at the issue as opposed to recommendation as opposed to the law. With these recommendations that are being made as it pertains to deadly force and use of force, how is that information to be used by just giving a definition? A definition of deadly force, as been stated, has many arms, and there are different situations that happen that require the use of force or the requirement of the use of deadly force. And to give a definition is to give individuals an opportunity to say, well, you didn't do it this way, you didn't do it that way, when that person that has to make that decision is not making that decision based upon a definition. That he's making that, he or she is making that decision based upon the fluidness of the situation that they're dealing with, the protections of others, and the preservation of life. So to have a policy to be put out there amongst all the law enforcement officers that saying you will do it this way as it pertains to that, I think that creates a problem in itself. And as far as agencies that don't want to look at the recommendations and the penalty for not looking at those recommendations or following those recommendations is another problem that you will present unless you're going through legislation to make certain acts and certain movements a law. If you're doing it that way, then law enforcement throughout the state of North Carolina will conform to whatever the law is and not necessarily to what a recommendation is. Now, best practices for those administrative individuals that run their agencies, I believe and hope and pray that they're doing what is right and what they think is the best way to follow that for the safety and welfare of not only their staff, but the general public and who they come in contact with. So when we look at the totality of all those situations, just a definition, we have to understand, number one, what is the definition? How is the definition going to be used? And is this a definition that will be reported to the judicial system and as far as an action on that? So that's what I'm looking at the probability of those recommendations. Like, all the comments are great. All the comments are neat. In fact, I think Mr. Pittman put out one important question when he asked who will have access to this particular type of information and what would be the purpose of that. So I think that was a good point made also.
Thank you, Sheriff. Does anyone have any additional? I know that with traffic stop data, the data is anonymized, and so it doesn't show directly who that, for the public, on the public facing side, but surely those individuals that run those departments and offices know who their officers are for a more granular accountability side of it or review of it within their own agencies for reporting. I don't want to close discussion and without folks getting an opportunity to weigh in. We want to make great use of our time, and we're well ahead of schedule. And so don't think that we're behind. So please, I encourage you to weigh in. And if it's not just about the definition, as we have discussed, and certainly recognize that there are some areas to work on. It could be about what did you hear our vision for the future in our state to be as it relates to the use of force as well. And so we want to help build that vision as well.
Mr. Secretary, can I add one point of clarity for the definition portion?
Yes, sir, certainly.
And when I speak, for me, as I understand it, or as I try to explain it as well, when I talk definition, not so much a you shall or you will, but more so a if you do this or if you do that, it will be reported. I agree with the chief and both the sheriff as well. When we go to trying to tell agencies how to do things, we really open up that box of unknowns, because every situation obviously is different. I guess my position on the definition is, if you do a certain act. Now, when we'll talk something simple like placing somebody on the ground, some agencies don't see that as a use of force. Here at the Raleigh Police Department, if you put someone on the ground, that's going to be considered a use of force that you would do a special report for. And that's either physically taking them and placing them on the ground, or ordering them to the ground at gunpoint, or whatever the case may be. And so from my perspective and point, when I say definition, I'm saying equaling the playing field. If you have one agency that doesn't report anytime they put someone on the ground, and then you have another agency that reports every time they put somebody on the ground, where it's gonna look like one agency is really heavy on using force when the other agency is not. And that may not be the case at all. So when I say standardized definition, I'm more so talking about the acts, not so much how to do police work as it relates to the definition. One more thing, as to Mr. Pittman's question, and obviously I'm not an agency head. I wouldn't see any reason why we wouldn't have this data, or recommend that this data be published or put out for anyone to see. Agencies don't use force on each other. Obviously, we're using force on the community. So why wouldn't the community be privy to the information of what their agencies, how much force their agency used, when their agency used force, and then what the requirement is for their agency to report that force? I don't see any reason why we wouldn't recommend that it be open for public view.
Sheriff Clemens, I concur, Mr. Secretary, I concur with Sergeant Garden's assessment of that, to make it available to the general public as far as that information. I concur.
Thank you both. Sergeant Garden's point is certainly well taken. When you could have a department who is being very transparent, and their use of force statistics may show that they place folks on the ground. It may be part of a handcuffing technique. It may be something a little bit more volatile versus a department that does not caption that data, or does not consider handcuffing on the ground, or somebody being ordered to the ground at gunpoint. Then that could skew the public view of how that department is operating versus another department is operating, when in fact it may be the department that counts and shows all of these incidents that may be more open and transparent to the public, as opposed to a department that may look like they don't have any use of force. So I think we have to be very, very intentional about how we define it, or how we, and if there is no solid definition about what the demands are on departments for that. And I'm throwing that out there for food for thought, without trying to portray where I feel on particular issues, but I just want to give an opportunity for engagement and open it up to other folks without calling you out. But I hadn't heard from Tally yet, but I saw that he was on, so let me open it up, and the screen is blocking, so I don't know if Angelica Wynn is on here. So Mr. Wells or Mr.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I apologize. I had a conference call previously set before this was set, and couldn't get off it with the head of Medicaid. But I did raise some of our issues that we'll talk about with SROs with him. So I think this is exactly the right discussion, and I just want to support everything that I've heard since I joined, and I apologize for missing part of it. But I think having a set definition and set criteria as to how you capture that data is going to be critical for the data to be right with the public. And then something, we've talked about previously, I think in a prep session, was also that whether or not we need any context. Because obviously if you have really high data around one subgroup, say African-American, use of force against African-Americans, and it's 100% African-American county, that's obviously going to be different than in another county. And I assume most jurisdictions, people are just going to know by jurisdiction, but whatever context needs to go into that, I think is important. I think, based on my experience with how schools gave data from time to time in another setting, if there was wiggle room for folks who weren't doing a great job to be able to report their data to make it look like they were doing a better job, then that would happen, at least with some folks. And so I think, and the reverse is obviously true too. If you have let's just take Wake County, since we have 2 Wake County folks, if they're really transparent, they can end up looking different than what it actually is, and compared to other jurisdictions, if they're doing a really great job and other jurisdictions are not doing as good a job. So I think, the more that can happen with making sure that we're clear on what use of force is and how you actually get that data, because what's a little unclear to me, not being a law enforcement person, is that going to come from police reports? Is it going to come from the arrest data? Like, where is this information going to come from? Is it going to come from just a form that folks fill out where they check a box? How is that data collected? How do we ensure that jurisdictions are actually collecting it? And then who's it going to go to? And then what are they going to do with that data? And then how is it going to be actually made available in a way that's consistent? Are all difficult questions that I'm sure the rest of this working group has the answers to. But those are questions that I want to, just make sure that we're raising as we think through this, because this is as key an issue as I think anything that this task force is facing. And so we not only want to do it, but we want to do it well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. I'd like to open it up to our law enforcement professionals. What is the current practice in police departments, sheriff's departments in North Carolina about data collection, even if there's some nuances or differences between departments as to what you are collecting? Is that gleaned from incident reports? Are there separate forms if you're an accredited agency or an agency following best practices? And so I would open it back up to them and maybe answer Mr. Wells's question, within the limited context of who we have on the call, certainly knowing that you're not speaking for all 100 sheriff's departments or all multiple hundred police departments.
I think what Mr. Wells is bringing up is an issue of process. And when we start with the definition, we can build the process from there. And there already is a process in place in most agencies, even though they may define use of force differently. They probably have a process of how they report it. And now that process will be as different as the definitions are. Some departments will use their existing incident reports, their arrest reports. Other departments will have separate forms and reporting mechanisms and data gathering processes and so on. But the important thing is to have a process by which you can get the information and then report it in whatever way that process turns out to be. Secretary Hooks brought up accreditation. I think that's a very important aspect that we need to be mindful of, because that defines a process. So for the accredited agencies across the state, and unfortunately, there are only about 10% of the agencies, based on the last numbers I knew of, that are accredited by the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, which is the national nonprofit organization that is really the only one that does law enforcement accreditation across the country. So about 10% are at various levels of accreditation there. But they define standards which require agencies to set a definition, determine what that is, have a process, have documentation, have internal reviews, and then have external reviews if need be. At what point do you call an outside agency for investigation? At what point do you call the prosecutor's office? At what point do you do all these things that we've talked about? But accredited agencies have these things as part of the process because they have already gone through that exercise of figuring it out. The state is in the process of developing a state accrediting process as well. I don't know where they are on these kind of standards, but I think it would be important to include some sort of process development into the state process as well, because that will likely get to more agencies, particularly smaller agencies across the state. And when we have a process, then we can determine what a best practice is from that. And if there is encouragement for reporting to a central database through these standards from the state organization, which I think the Justice Academy is in a process of putting together, or from the national one through CALIA, well, then we have hopefully consistent data that we're then reporting and can do some analysis around.
Thank you, Chief. Does anybody else have anything that could lend toward the discussion topic brought up by Mr. Wells?
Secretary Hooks, Sheriff Clemens, backing up and joining in on what Chief Letney says, also to consider that because of that process of accreditation over the years, the cost of it has held back a lot of agencies from having the availability to do that. And now that we're looking at an accreditation process in the state of North Carolina, that will and should alleviate the cost and give other agencies opportunities to join in on those standards. Now, I know that some sheriff's agencies in the state of North Carolina, although they're not CALIA standard certified with accreditation, they have had other sheriff's offices in the state of North Carolina that are accredited to lend that particular policy and procedure to help those particular agencies throughout the state of North Carolina. Just because they did not have the financial means of getting accredited, they still have the scholastic means of putting together a decent policy and procedures to be able to follow. As far as the reporting situation is concerned, because we don't have a repository, most agencies will have it in the form of O2s and then separate reports for use of forces throughout that, which is maintained within the agency. And also whatever officers are involved in those particular issues, if it involves an investigation such as what we utilize with the SBI, then that will fall into that officer's book as far as their profile and their working experience as far as the policy is held in those particular agencies. So I think that, as the chief was saying, as we develop a better standard in North Carolina for accreditation, you will see that a lot of these issues that we're dealing with as far as from financial basis will dissipate.
Just one thing, Secretary Hooks.
Yes, sir.
One idea or thought I have, and I know we talk about training probably too much, different training opportunities, and I would think of training in this context, not to train everyone, although maybe that's part of it, but just training jurisdictions as to sort of the standard protocol for these things would be helpful. I would imagine, once there is a set definition, and once there is sort of some idea of this standard process, that there be some training just on how, making sure that folks are aware of the way that the state is expecting these things to happen. And I guess the last thing is if it fits within accreditation, that may or may not be a vehicle for some of this, but it sounds like that's part of what this discussion is about.
Thank you, sir. Let me move a little bit further down the road. Let me ask the group, what recommendations have you heard during this discussions, or what recommendations might you have to offer during this discussion as we try to move methodically through this process? You can cheat a little bit by looking at what's on the whiteboard before you.
What I heard was that we need a standard definition, and Chief Letney offered 2 vehicles where we could look for instead of reinventing the wheel. And that as a state, we may need accreditation to assist other agencies. Once we set the template, you need a way for people to follow it. And I agree with that because I live in New Hanover County, and I know both of our agencies are accredited, but the funds are there. And I know when they're going through accreditation, not to bother them.
Understood. It is a rigorous process, and it is a process that costs agencies money as well. Does anyone have any, want to highlight any of the recommendations as you have heard them? Or again, do you have any additional recommendations to bring to the table for some quick discussions, and then we can move further along with our considerations?
I'll say, Secretary Hooks, I'll say one thing about accreditation that I just learned, obviously, that the state was in the process of developing an accreditation for the state as far as that's concerned. It may, in my mind, and I'm just a simple guy from Greensburg, Kentucky, and so I tend to see things real simple. But if an agency says, I cannot afford to take part in a process that makes my agency better, I see a problem with that. And so maybe on a state level, that cost is at a minimum to the agency, because the accreditation is to say we are following a certain set of standards, and the accreditation of an agency brings that agency standards up. And I think it's kind of shameful if an agency can't afford it, and then they can't say, hey, we want to be a better agency simply because of a price tag. So if the state has the funds available to cover an agency that wants to be accredited, then those funds ought to be made available. And I know we start talking budgets and things of that nature, but I wouldn't, if we're talking about a true change in law enforcement and a true reimagining of public safety, if an agency says, I want somebody to hold me accountable, I want to prove that we are making strides to hold ourselves to a higher standard, that the cost of that process shouldn't be the reason why an agency doesn't do it.
Sergeant Garden, this is Sheriff Clemens again, just to expand on that. Because of the processes and what you're talking about and the monies, as far as the accreditation process that we're looking at in the state of North Carolina will be to a number that would be so advantageous to other agencies in the state of North Carolina, that will eliminate that particular disparity as far as trying to get monies and funding to do that. Also, I stated earlier, just consider that you don't have to have an accreditation to have accredited policy and procedure. You can get that same information from a neighboring agency, from another association, folks that have already created that wheel is there. You just tapping in on what they've done, and you're following and building your agency based upon those accredited procedures that have already been listed. So there are ways to be creative to get the information. It's just that we have to step outside of the box and make it happen. And I agree with you that money should never be an issue to make your agency better, as far as for the agency and for the community also.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir.
Both the sheriff and the sergeant are absolutely right, in my opinion. There are costs associated with this kind of thing. My experience with other state accrediting agencies, if it is a state-run program, it is cost-free to the agency, meaning that the state assumes that cost to manage the program, implement it, conduct assessments, and so on. The other cost associated with this is on the agency to develop their policies. That takes staff time. It takes other resources. It may take infrastructure upgrades, but it's all a good thing in that ultimately it makes the agency better. But in some ways, it may require some significant cost to upgrade a facility, for example, to meet a certain group of standards. And while that would be the best practice, it may not be possible for a small agency. So some grant funds or some other way to accomplish that would be helpful. But to the sheriff's point, there is so much sharing going on of best practice that certain agencies that have developed a really good policy, they are sharing that information. So not only does that help the agencies that can't afford it, it gets some more consistency across the state into how law enforcement handles certain types and certain calls and so on. So I think we do have to be cognizant of the cost involved, but look at those other ways to get information out and about. And I think one of the things that we need to figure out as we're talking about a standard definition is who's going to come up with this. I would suggest maybe the Justice Academy take the lead. They have trained instructors and they do a lot of research on this kind of thing. But I also think it needs to go beyond the Justice Academy. The State Chiefs Association should be involved. State Sheriff's Association should be involved, and get some of that real world experience that is going on right now in these agencies. And then the training that was brought about, I think that's an excellent idea. That can be made part of a new chiefs training program. That can be part of a new sheriff's training program, because agency heads have to understand and implement and be accountable for that as well. So as we talk about the recommendations, we also have to think about the process and how are we going to get to that implementation. I know we don't need to get in the weeds of it right now, but thinking of it in a more broad sense may help us figure out what is a realistic recommendation versus what is not.
Thank you, Chief. I just want to test the temperature and get the reaction to the idea that as much as we can of developing recommendation that utilizes structures that are in place, resources for one, as offered in the Chief's recommendation, Justice Academy, Police Chiefs Association, Sheriff's Association. And then also on a data collection standpoint, assuming that we get to a standardized definition and reporting, your reaction or any thoughts of either pro or con toward that data collection being with the State Bureau of Investigation, who already has a data reporting system that receives uniform crime reports and traffic data reports from local sheriffs and police departments as well. I just want to put that out there, and then maybe that spurs some thinking towards some additional recommendations, or any of the recommendations that you that have really resonated with you, an opportunity to comment on that before we close out on this segment.
Secretary Hooks,
Yes, ma'am.
this is Jasmine. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to let the group know that the staff has had conversations with both the Justice Academy and both standards divisions about their accreditation work, where that process is and how it might interact with some of the ideas that you all are wrestling with, including potentially Sentinel event review. So those conversations have started, and the Justice Academy in particular has expressed an interest in being involved and assisting with whatever we end up drafting.
Secretary Hooks, this is Tally Wells. Just looking back at the terrific materials that Jeff and Greg and others sent the group, I think there's a lot of really good recommendations around use of force, but then there's also recommendations around de-escalation and making sure that there's standardization around some of sort of when you use force and all of that. And I think those are outside the context of what we're talking about now, but I felt like, you know, what Charlotte Mecklenburg had and what the sort of the general consensus paper that included a lot of the major law enforcements from across the country had good recommendations. There's certainly some that are controversial, but I think that, I guess my question is, are we going to at some point discuss those as well as just a standard definition and data collection? Because I felt like those are pretty strong recommendations where there may already be consistency in North Carolina, but where we may want to discuss as well at some point.
Thank you, sir. Does anyone else, would anyone else like to weigh in on those issues? We do need to make sure we cover some of the other areas that I think we do have some really wide agreement on, that we may not, and I don't want to say we were bogged down. It's appropriate that we operate from a common language and a common data set concerning use of force. So does anybody else would anybody else like to weigh in with Mr. Wells' follow-up?
Yeah, this is Kerwin, Secretary Hooks. Yeah, I like to weigh in with Mr. Wells' sentiment as well. I would like to, and I'm pretty sure we're going to get to other recommendations besides the ones that is currently on our plate to tackle. But I think pretty much for the repository and for the use of force definition, I think pretty much the groundwork for us to build from is kind of laid out. And not to say I'm the chairman or nothing to try to move the meeting along, but I'm saying I think we got a pretty good start point from where we have been, and I'm content with where we are. And if no one has any other things to say, I would like to kind of keep the meat so we can kind of get into the meat and potatoes of other issues as well. But I concur and I uplift everything everyone has said. This has been a great discussion so far on the definition of the use of force.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to second the motion that Mr. Pittman didn't make, but I'm going to go ahead and move us on with that idea. I agree. It has been a wonderful conversation, very informative, and I appreciate everyone really truly listening to each other. One of the other areas, just in general, I think there was broad agreement from the survey was Sentinel event reviews. I know that, and I do want to open it back up for some discussion, because I don't think that it really centered on whether or not they should occur. It's just a matter of who should conduct them. And so we want to talk about Sentinel events reviews, and that's a little different than the criminal investigation, internal affairs investigation. Sometimes there may be a mixing and a blurring of the line as to, but it's to get kind of at the heart of the matter and as to what happened and how departments can improve from a Sentinel event review. And I do see Mr. Pittman's up now, and so I'll let him go ahead and speak on Sentinel event reviews, his view on an external review, and then maybe that will foster some additional conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Hooks. Yeah, my views on an external Sentinel event review. I think for the sake of transparency, to allow the agency in which the incident is taking place to do a Sentinel review, I pretty much thinks it kind of obscure transparency for community right now. During the current climate of things, transparency is indeed important in the work that we're doing across the state. And so for that reason, I feel that it should be an outside entity looking and conducting these reviews to report and say, well, this is the review that we have. This is what we found out based off of this review, versus allowing the agency to conduct it, because it can become the water's a little muddy, so to say. And not to say that that this will happen, but I know that it's a possibility that this could happen. And so I feel like our job as a task force is to try to eliminate as many hurdles that individuals may have from seeking transparency, and as well as seeking justice and eliminating racial biases within the criminal justice system. So it's like to allow the perpetrator to conduct an investigation on why he attacked you, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And it's just, it's my thoughts on it.
All right. Thank you. Does anyone else have some companion or counter thoughts to what's been offered by Mr. Pittman?
Secretary Hooks, if I could add just a bit of context for the group.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to let everybody know that Sentinel event reviews is a topic that has also come up in Working Group 1. And so there's been some discussion kind of at the staff level, and then as well with the co-chairs, about how to further develop that idea. And the kind of wet clay concept that's been floated at this point is that there would be a joint committee or joint task force of some kind between the Criminal Justice Standards Commission and the Sheriff's Standards Commission that would, as one of its functions, conduct these Sentinel event reviews. And I think the idea there was partly along the lines of what Mr. Pittman has been suggesting, to have an entity that's separate from the agency under consideration, but also an organization that has some background and context and expertise to be in a position to conduct those reviews. So I mentioned that not because that idea has been settled at all, but it's an idea that's been
suggested, and it probably would be interesting for the group to weigh in on that concept and whether that meets the need or how it might need to be adjusted to meet the need. So that's just wanted to make the group aware that that's kind of an area of overlapping interest, and it's an area where there's been some kind of thinking and development and questions being discussed at the staff level. And again, as I said, with the co-chairs.
Thank you. Mr. Welty is right where I wanted us to be, to lay that out before you all, to get some initial reactions within a short period of time frame so that we can continue those discussions and vet those between that working group and our working group. So we won't spend nearly the amount of time that we did on the use of force. Not that it's not as important, or maybe perhaps even more important, depending on your perspective. It's just that we've got some additional work in collaboration with another work group going. So does anybody else have any additional thoughts about Sentinel review as laid out, the concern by Mr. Pittman, and then the direction that we believe we're heading as laid out by Mr. Welty?
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir.
Just a couple of thoughts. I'm happy to hear that the other working group is also addressing this, and I think I'm probably a little further in the conversation than we are. I like the idea of the Joint Standards Commissions being involved in this. I'm a little concerned about the concept that this is that there won't be liability come of it, because I think there could. And I think we have to address some of those issues and concerns. And I think it's a great way for us to look at a situation and be better as a profession. But unless we address some of those concerns, I think we're not going to get the collaboration of agencies or individuals that we need to have to make it truly effective. I know there are some agencies across the country that are doing this already. I believe one in Arizona has been doing this for a while that I know of. And they're using outside consultants. So for an agency that has the means to do so, there are consultant groups that do this and provide that similar thing. So I would not like to see this as a requirement, but more encouraging agencies and give them an option of how to do that, what is best in the eyes of that agency, and more so that community. So it's not only one way to get to that end goal.
Thank you, Chief. Just for our use of time, and I'll come back and allow for members to weigh in on areas that they don't think that we've adequately covered. But the under use of force, there was another area that I at least want to get out here on the table before we start moving any further along. That's the prohibition of officers from using deadly force against suspects who pose only a risk of death or serious injury to themselves, such as a case where somebody is threatening suicide. And so I would like to hear from the group concerning this, and if you can mix in not only what the problem statement is, but if you have some recommendations in our time frame. And again, I offered these at the beginning, but rightly so. We had to spend that amount of time on use of force, and not saying that we cleared that, but I want to make sure that we give this some air as well.
Mr. Secretary, Sheriff Clemens.
Yes, sir.
When that issue came up, it was kind of confusing. I don't know what the outcome would be if you're talking about a prohibition on use of force against a mentally unstable person who is not trying to harm others, but they're trying to harm themselves, but we will assist them in the use of deadly force. That's just an oxymoron to me. I think that when we're in a situation where that person is not trying to hurt the officer or hurt the general public and they're hurting themselves, I think that's where pieces of the de-escalation piece comes in. The piece of dealing with mental health, with the training and the CIT that we're having officers go through, and in our agencies, we're trying to get to 100%. But I agree, we should never be using deadly force to prevent. I don't know if you're using deadly force to prevent an act that a mentally unstable person is trying to do. It sounds more like to me you're assisting them in accomplishing that goal that you may think or they may think that they're trying to reach at that point. So I'm definitely one that does not believe that we should be using deadly force against a mentally ill patient in the event when they're trying to harm themselves.
All right. Thank you, Sheriff. Anyone else?
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir.
I agree with the sheriff 100%. However, I'm also concerned about prohibition and the fact that the officer is going to have to justify how that person posed a threat only to themselves. These are dynamic, chaotic, ever-changing circumstances that will turn in an instant. So to say a person is only a threat to themselves, that may be the case up until whatever changes in their mind. And if it's someone who's mentally unstable, we can't predict that. And then they go from being a threat to themselves to being a threat to someone else, be that a neighbor, an officer, a passerby, an innocent person. While I agree that we should not be using deadly force against someone who's only a threat to themselves, determining that in the chaos of this type of interaction is untenable, and trying to make the officer figure that out and be right 100% of the time is not realistic.
Thank you, Chief. And maybe for conversation purposes, maybe prohibition may be the wrong word. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, maybe it's encourage the recognition of an individual who only poses a threat to themselves, and working through some wording, and we could ask staff to help us address that. But I like to put that out to the group first, based on what you've heard already. I think generally there is agreement that law enforcement should not be assisting in someone's suicide, even though there is a very real phenomena of suicide by cop, as it's commonly known as. But how do we get to that? And I think the de-escalation crisis intervention training is key to that. But I welcome comments to move us through this.
Mr. Secretary, I would have to agree with the chief on the aspect that the situations are very fluid. I think we all can agree that if it's a simple only trying to harm myself, then obviously deadly force is not the fix for that. However, I think there's a number of probably way too many factors that would have to be taken into consideration to put the word prohibition on it. If somebody gets in the center of a mall and decides that they want to shoot themselves, how fast can that go from just being a threat to myself to being a threat to everybody who's in the mall? And those situations would almost be impossible to determine where the threat and when the threat is and that kind of thing. Simply holding a gun to my head, walking toward a preschool or a daycare center, although I may only be threatening myself at that moment, my behavior is indicating that I may be posing a threat to a number of kids at a daycare center. So to use the word prohibited becomes very problematic in that stance. But I also agree that if someone is only trying to hurt themselves, then there's got to be a way to get them the services that they need without intervening by the means of deadly force.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it appears to me that the law enforcement kind of understands the perspective of the dynamics. But I would like to quickly open it up to other working group members. Is there some understanding that we're missing or perspective that you have that is different?
Oh, go ahead,
Deborah. No, you go ahead first.
Well, first, Secretary, thank you for allowing us the opportunity, but this is the intersectionality of another section where we said there was a need for trained mental health professionals. So a lot of the things we're looking at have a direct link with another part. And this definitely does. North Carolina was not the place where a 13-year-old child mother called for someone and he got shot. And he was much smaller than most of us. So these are the people we're concerned about. So we, one, need to go back when we look at having mental health people. I agree about CIT because I know Chief Davis from Durham has said that she's also working at 100% or trying to get there. And I heard Chief Clemens mention that. That's important, but also to include the mental health trainers or those who are trained in this along with the police, which is another area.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Wells?
Yeah, I'll echo what Deborah said, which I think that this is definitely a reason to increase, to get back to our crisis intervention topic that we've discussed to some degree. And what I've heard from law enforcement is that there needs to be something available when, if you get trained in crisis intervention training, there has to be some sort of crisis intervention of services available so that there's something that is the alternative to sort of a binary choice about whether to sort of arrest somebody or do some, or de-escalate the situation but not have services. So that's one thing. The second issue is I was just thinking through sort of various hypotheticals, which I know are very real for our law enforcement task force members, but I can see very much how this could be a dynamic, fluid situation. So I think, figuring out a way to have a recommendation that really encourages best practice and making sure that we are clear that in such a situation, someone should not be harmed or lose their life when they're in a suicide, while recognizing that this is a dynamic situation and officers, obviously will need to respond to a dynamic situation based on whatever's happening. I don't know exactly how to strike that balance. So I really liked your idea to sending it back to Jeff and Greg because they're super smart and can help us think that through. But I do think that's the dynamic I've been trying to sort of wrestle with in my head. And so I really liked Deborah's suggestion that we also think about this from a mental health standpoint, in addition to thinking about it from just sort of what the officer's facing right at that moment.
Thank you. And I think that will flow well into our later presentations and discussions about the CAHOOTS and STAR model that kind of come back with the co-responder model, which is a further meeting down the road, but point well taken. We're at the appointed time where I need to kind of shift gears, but I want to make sure that that individuals have felt that the discussions have been worthwhile and that you've been heard, or if there's any question about that, I want to entertain that at this time.
Yeah, this is Kerwin. I just wanted to comment on the individual who may be attempting to commit suicide by law enforcement. So with the word prohibition being on the beginning of this recommendation, it kind of doesn't, in my opinion, need a warrant to be changed because once the individual say is in a public area and he has the gun to his head and say he begins to point the gun at somebody else, it then spurs into a different situation other than this recommendation, and then appropriate actions may be taken and may be warranted at that point. But the way I saw it was if an individual has a firearm to his own head or a knife to his own throat, that he should not be no type of deadly force should be used against this individual. And so that's why the word prohibition at the beginning of it didn't kind of strike a discord or with me per se, because I thought about how fluid the situation may be and could turn. And when that situation does turn, it is no longer the recommendation in which we were speaking of, saying that the individual should not be use deadly force against him when he's trying to commit suicide against himself. And we must understand that law enforcement, even though I'm not on a trained law enforcement officer, but I understand that these individuals are trained, and training means that they are prepared to encounter these type of situations. And so that leads to more CTI training within these departments, as well as them being aware that these situations could take place and practicing on other repercussions, non-lethal repercussions for situations like this. So if he has a gun pointed at his head in a crowded mall, do you have to use deadly force on this person? Can you just shoot them in the leg, or can you just tase them? It's different other means than actually using deadly force on this individual. So the word prohibition on the beginning of it didn't bother me at all, because once the individual takes the gun or the knife or grabs somebody else, it then spurs into another whole situation, thus not even needing the need for this recommendation.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to ask Jeff and the other staff members from DOJ to go ahead and begin working on a draft process for where we are in the use of force as well. Those will be circulated to the members ahead of time and take into discussions, and I'll certainly make myself available to you to see if my recollections match up to the notes that you all have taken. So I'll ask Jeff and Greg to move us forward on that. And so thank you all for that great discussion. I'm going to pivot now to SROs. And again, we want to follow kind of like the same format that we have utilized. If you could think through the presentations that have been given to you and information that was shared with you, and perhaps even lend from your personal experiences into that for this discussions about what do you hear the problem statement of being with SROs, and what is the vision for the state moving forward with SROs, and what recommendations do you have, as well. And so we want to be good listeners. You don't have to support each other's arguments to support and reaffirm each other. But I do want us to move through this with the idea that SROs are in place. They have been funded. I know that there have been some discussions about should they even be in place. And so you shouldn't be limited by that aspect, that you cannot voice your opinion that they are, that you may disagree with them even being there. However, I would talk about, if you have a recommendation beyond that they shouldn't be there, well, if they are there, how should we move forward? Again, because we want some things that are actionable, and certainly can note the idea that if the working group believes that they don't have a place, or whether or not that place is through defining the proper role and definition of an SRO, and what that means to be an SRO, and what they should be involved in, what they shouldn't be involved in, keeping in mind some of the presentations that we got from Judge Corpening and Deputy Secretary Lasser. That may help us as well. And so I will open it up to discussions again, with the problem statements, your vision for the future. What recommendations have you heard through our previous discussions, or do you have, and what other recommendations should we be discussing? I'm going to go to Deborah Maxwell. I'm going to call on you because you have been in tune with SROs from a community level standpoint. Deborah.
Yes, sir.
All right. Do you have some thoughts on SROs that we could begin the discussions with?
I truly understand, because Florida and I believe Sandy Hook, the increase in the need in the usage of SROs within the school system. But we have to look at the increase in the number of children in the school to prison pipeline because of the existence of the SRO within the school system, because principals and administrators will gladly utilize them instead of knowing to use their proper administrative skills as school principals, teachers using proper classroom management skills, or maybe they need an education to understand the proper usage of SROs. I would really like the reductions in elementary schools personally. And the reason why some school justice partnerships have a decrease, it won't be a memo up there. We created an alternative school. And as soon as we created that alternative school, our suspension rate dropped because the child didn't get suspended. They got sent to that school. So that is a point to consider when you look at the data. Also, it makes the county look good real fast.
Thank you, ma'am. Point well taken. Mr. Wells, you've had some interest in this area, so I'd like to hear from you, and then I'll turn to two of our law enforcement work group members.
Thank you. And I guess I've always seen this issue as larger than school resource officers. And I think, so I definitely want to have that conversation about school resource officers and whether they need to exist as prevalently as they do in the state. But I also don't want such a critical issue to sideline sort of some of the larger issues. And I know that there's another working group that's also focused on juvenile justice, but to me, school resource officers, and I guess the issue is that they tend to be sort of the gateway into the criminal justice system from the schools, for good and for bad. But they're sort of they're the vehicle. And that the larger issue in my mind is that too many children of color, too many children, period, but too many particularly children of color are entering the criminal justice system. And that my vision for the future that I would recommend is that we, in order to take that on in a productive way, that we have robust school juvenile court partnerships, that we support what North Carolina is already doing, that we have significant data collection that runs the gambit from in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions and alternative schools and homebound on the school's discipline side, all the way to school-based arrests and the delinquency data, and that all of that is transparent for the previous year based on race, gender, economic status that I've proposed previously, and that I've gotten a lot of very positive feedback from lots and lots of folks that this is something that's really needed for the state, but that is sort of part of a vision for the future, that we are reducing the entry of children into the criminal justice system, but we're also reducing the amount of exclusionary discipline, and that we're increasing school-based behavioral health services and school climate services. And we're doing all of that in part through robust school juvenile court partnerships. And I could see how there would be a lot of folks who would think that that's a little bit of mission shift from just the question of SROs. But I really, I would argue strongly that all of those sort of fit, especially since North Carolina has done so much work on the school justice partnerships, that all of those sort of fit within the common framework of SROs, and that the presence of SROs is definitely part of that conversation, but should not be sort of the only thing we're talking about. And with respect to what Ms. Maxwell said, I would agree that I would like us to really think through funding for SROs in elementary schools, but I'd like to think about that in the larger context of the system, and that it's not just about necessarily reducing SROs in every jurisdiction as much as it's really thinking through what we're using our dollars for and where can we get the most bang for our buck. Is it by having an SRO in the elementary schools, or is it by having really good supports and services for children in the schools, so that there's less and less of a need for SROs? And to the extent there are SROs anywhere, that they're really about the perimeter and protecting the schools, and how much is that really needed based on the data versus what sort of the news tells us the need is, which I think may be two different things, but I'd need to explore that a little bit more.
Thank you. And before I turn to some of our law enforcement members on here, and you can refer back to your own agenda. I won't read it to you. That these are some areas that we want to touch on through this discussion to support the continued development of mandate for school justice partnerships. And we've heard from individuals who have been involved with this, the collection and publishing of data about school-based referrals and SRO involvement, enhanced training for SROs, enhanced training for school personnel and the proper role of SROs. And so that as to your point and Ms. Maxwell's point, that the appropriate role of the educators and the administrators in schools take on those roles. And then also efforts to engage in supportive behavior, to benefit our children, such as school counselors, social workers, and psychologists certainly need to be a part of that. I will tell you that in my travels as the Secretary of Public Safety, very interested in school safety issues that I have not readily encountered law enforcement officers who had preferred engagement versus social work, clinicians, psychologists, and folks from schools, but have sometimes been pushed into that realm based on the dynamics of their schools or the lack of resources in other areas to address a child. And then also and I'll stop right there and open it up to our law enforcement folks for your perspectives and any personal experiences that you have that could lend to this conversation. Again, looking toward what you believe the problem statement to be, either as clearly stated or out there in this area of responsibility for us, what our vision for North Carolina is toward the future, and what recommendations that you have. I am an end user of your recommendations and policy decisions because we do not want young people coming into the juvenile justice system when there is absolutely no need for them to be engaged in any formal way. And so with that, I want to open it to our law enforcement representatives.
Secretary Hooks, Sheriff Clemens, I agree with the comments that have been made, but here's the situation. There is not only a definition for SRO officers, but the administrators and the teachers need to understand what the role of the SRO officer is. He is not their hand as far as on the end of discipline. That is not what that officer is put there for. Although that officer there builds good rapport with the kids, a lot of times that officer receives information that's happening not only in the community, but coming to the school. And the administrators are never privy to that information because the children are just not talking to them. Now, we also have to understand the fact that the school to prison pipeline, I understand that concept. I've heard it for many years, but also too, you have to understand, you take away the SRO officer from the school, who's responding to that call now? Now you have another law enforcement officer that's not an SRO officer, not familiar with the school, not familiar with the procedures. They're coming there for one purpose only, to deal with the security issue, the lawless issue that may be happening at that particular moment. So having that school resource officer in the school is advantageous to the community, to the schools, and to the students and staff. What we do, just speaking of what I do in Richmond County, every single day, I have a law enforcement officer that goes into the school. They go and they speak and they communicate with the kids. They socialize with the children. Then they're off to the next school. This is what we do on a daily basis, even though that Richmond County is one of those unique counties that has a school police that most folks call SROs, but they are actually a police department hired by the school system and managed by the school system. But the biggest thing I've seen by talking to officers, being in the schools, talking to the children, is that the officer is being used as an arm of the administration to produce discipline. That's not what that's about. Also, too, when they said by opening up alternative schools, I'm here to tell you, from being in these particular schools, they don't always get the same educational piece that the other schools are getting, because they have been taken out of a disturbing situation where they're interrupting the class. And now they're in their own particular area, such as an alternative school, where they can disrupt the class all day long. And who are they disrupting the class with? Other individuals who have been deemed in trouble or having problems in the regular school, that they had to open up an alternative school to deal with those. The other issue is we have to consider that in juvenile justice, there are diversion programs. Everybody is not going in judicial system as far as the teens are concerned. They have opportunities to talk with those juvenile officers to say, look, what can we do to work with this kid? How can we work with this? This kid does not need to be in the school. These school resource officers are having that opportunity and having those discussions to do what need to be do. But listen to this. We're all parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters. Think about this. Without that first line in that school for that purpose of chaos, what happens when there's no one there and then officers have to respond to an area that they may not be familiar with, may not have adequate information, and can't get to the children or to the perpetrator as quickly as possible as they would have had if they had that school resource officer in place.
Thank you, Sheriff. We're always looking for positive outcomes. Sergeant Garton or Chief, if I could get one of you to weigh in now, and then we'll go back to one of our non-governmental members.
I'll, Mr. Secretary, I'll agree with the Sheriff Clemens there wholeheartedly, 100%. And I'm going to echo some of it again because I promised my SROs here that every time I had an opportunity, I would say this. And so I'm going to hold true to my promise that schools have to do a better job at training their employees and their staff to understand what that SRO is for. A lot of times what we're seeing as it relates to this school to prison pipeline, you end up with kids being introduced into the juvenile justice system for what I like to refer to as confrontational charges. Johnny won't sit down. Teacher goes out of the room, grabs a police officer comes in and tries to make Johnny sit down. Johnny's still not sitting down. Then you have a confrontation between that law enforcement officer and that student that ends up with them being charged with something like resist, delay, and obstruct, or something like trespassing, or something of that nature, which would have never taken place had the schools done a better job, or had the teacher in that particular scenario done a better job at understanding the behavioral issue that Johnny was having and not introducing law enforcement into that situation. I think SROs are a definite need for the simple fact that, God forbid, an active shooter or some other incident takes place at a school. You can't press rewind and go, well, if we had an SRO here. I just think the school system has to do a better job of training its people on how to utilize that SRO. And I think we've also got to change what the SRO stands for at the school. They're not so much law and order at the school as they are safety and security. And it may even be worth bringing up a discussion or a topic about subject matter jurisdiction at the school. I think we can all agree that drugs and guns are a no-no at school. But do we really want our students charged with misdemeanor larceny of cell phones and things of that nature, or do we really want them charged with these less than felonious assaults, maybe a pushing and a shoving, and you have one parent demanding charges? So I think there's a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration. But I think, again, like Sheriff Clemens said, the biggest issue being they are there for the safety and security of the school. However, the school system kind of forces them into some issues a lot of times based off behavior. And I've said it and I'll say it again. If we can afford to put an SRO in every school, we can afford to have at least one social worker in every school. I don't understand why we don't do that.
Thank you, Sergeant. One of our other public members, Mr. Pittman, would you like to weigh in on this discussion? Again, particularly with your view as the problem statement, either recapturing what's already been out there, or if you see some additional, and what do you see our vision for the state is, and any recommendations that you have heard or would offer?
Yes, thank you. So listen to what everyone has been uplifting about SROs, the pros and the cons. What comes to mind is not only informing the school officials about SRO's role, but informing SROs, particularly in setting a standard about their roles within this type of system. So just as easily as the school official went and got the SRO to make little Johnny sit down, the SRO should have been easily to be able to discern and say, okay, well, this is not my place? Is this an active threat to the safety of this environment? So we definitely have to set the standard for SROs when it comes to that as well, because I believe that it's on both ends, as well as an advisory board for these SROs. I've been looking at different types of model, and I'll have to go back and find an actual state. But some of these states are putting advisory boards in for SROs, into which the SRO meets with stakeholders from the community and different stakeholders within the public education system or the education system with the SRO monthly to basically discuss any incidents that is taking place at that school that month, dealing with the SRO and his involvement in this. And that kind of puts a buffer or a filter, so to speak, in between the school to prison pipeline, because if the right people are in place on this advisory board, this will kind of elevate the need for his behavior to be toned down, or the staff behavior to be toned down when it comes to utilizing the SROs particularly. So I was looking at that, and I'm gonna have to do a little more in-depth research as far as SROs, and probably report back at a later date for more of my thoughts and recommendations at this point.
Thank you, sir. Chief, I'd like to get an opportunity to get you in again. If you can help us really narrow in on some of the problematic issues or problem statements in the vision for North Carolina moving forward from your experience, both here in the state and nationally.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think there is an absolute place for school resource officers in the school community as part of the school community. That has to be defined, and it has to be very clear as to what the role of the SRO is and what it isn't. So the problem statement, I understand that where those come from. I'm not sure we have good data around all that, at least not consistent data, as we've talked about in other topics. So the gathering of that information should be better defined. But I think when we have a good school justice partnership, when we have stakeholders at the table who all have the same goal, which is safety and security of the school community and a good learning environment, and when we have a good memorandum of understanding between the school system and whatever agency provides the SRO service, we will be light years ahead of where we are now. I think a lot of where the problems come from is what everyone has talked about, is that the school system is using law enforcement officers in ways they shouldn't. Law enforcement officers are accepting that they're being used in ways that they shouldn't. And there is either no clear definition of where an SRO gets involved and where they don't, or the school administrator is not following a proper MOU. I would like to have a further discussion down the line, not for this topic, but about the different experience in districts where the SROs are part of the school system, as the sheriff mentioned, versus those that come from the agency that has jurisdiction in and around the school, be that the sheriff's office, the city police, or whatnot, and just see if there's some differences there. My experience in other places in North Carolina is there are differences. How that fleshes out, I'm not too sure. So I think that's something to be looked at further. So I think we also need to look at training of school resource officers. And even before that, we need to look at selection of school resource officers. We as law enforcement administrators should be putting our best officers who want to be in that role as SROs, and then training them and having a good MOU to guide their actions. Unfortunately, I think some agencies don't do that. They take officers for whatever reason and put them in schools when that's not their skill set. And I think that that can be problematic. I think selection of SROs is not solely the role of the agency. I think the school district should be involved in that. And I think there should be community stakeholders involved in that. There should be a process to select that SRO. There should be interviews. There should be other things to make sure we're picking the right person. But understand that that officer is responsible to his or her agency and community, and that is beyond just that school administrator. That is the school community and the stakeholders above that. So good school justice partnerships, good MOUs, good training, good selection, and having those guidelines in place is important. I think the school administrator is going to rely too heavily on the SRO. If that SRO is removed, is not going to change that school administrator's reliance on law enforcement. They are just going to be calling 911. And as the sheriff pointed out, an officer is going to respond who is not familiar with the school system, the building, the students, the culture, any of that, and it's going to actually be worse. As far as elementary school SROs, I think we should enhance that. I think we should have more officers in elementary schools. We have talked at length about relationships between police and community and how to enhance those relationships so that the engagements go better. What better way than to establish a relationship when a student is at his or her formative years and can see a police officer as a helper, not an enforcer. And I can tell you, my elementary school SROs, the kids love him. And when you have a police officer out playing kickball or in the gym shooting hoops or doing whatever with the kids, in elementary schools, there's not a lot of law enforcement going on. There's a lot of relationship building. There's a lot of mentoring. There's a lot of helping through life's problems, be it bullying, be it other issues, and actually working not only with the student and the staff, but with the families as well. And when you have a robust program that incorporates that, when you have a good school justice partnership, a good MOU, you can have a program that enhances the learning environment and doesn't detract from it in ways that create the school to prison pipeline or other problems as we've discussed.
Thank you, Chief. And I'll just go ahead and forecast. I'm going to ask Jeff Welty and Jasmine McGee and Greg Saban to weigh in as they deem appropriate in just a minute, but I'll give them a minute to think about this because I know that there was one of the working groups that had some interest in addressing concerning issues around SROs, and maybe they can shed light on some of that. I also would like for them to think about embracing, or all of us to think about, perhaps a recommendation is to embrace the work of the School Justice Partnership in furtherance of that. They have spent much more time than we have within our task force to address that. And I am a firm believer if we're on pace and on track to using things that work, then we can embrace the work that they do, even if we aren't as well versed on every detail that they have. And then perhaps also embracing, and I say maybe equally, embracing the work of the Governor's Task Force for Safer Schools, but maybe with the nuance, with a particular emphasis on the use of counselors, clinicians, psychologists in their work, as well as they are moving forward with some recommendations. I'm a firm believer that where we can, if we can utilize a whole of government, whole of community approach for a number of things, then we are certainly better off. And I've tried to work through this meeting, as I will the others, not really trying to portray how Eric Hooks feels so that I don't overshadow anyone else's opinion, but I'll be quite frank with you. There's nothing more passionate that I am about than about the success of our children. Anybody who knows me, both in my professional and personal life, they already know that, whether I'm coaching or whether I'm sitting in the secretary's chair, that we must do all we can to keep our children safe, to keep them engaged in communities, and to make them feel a part of a larger society, because it really begins and ends with them. And there's no stump speech. This is the core of who we all should be in our society. And so I'm going to ask that we go ahead and open it up to our substantive leads from the AG's office for some thoughts concerning what other working groups where there may be an interface opportunity, and then open it back up to the larger working group as to your thoughts about embracing the work of the school justice partnerships and the Task Force for Safer Schools, as you've heard some of the previous discussions. So Jeff, Jasmine, and Greg.
Sure thing. Yes, you're right. There's other working groups that are looking at different facets of this issue. particularly the working group that has the juvenile justice system within its purview is interested in a lot of similar types of initiatives. I don't think there's anything this group has discussed that's incompatible with what that working group is talking about. But as the discussion moves further from SROs and more into juvenile justice referrals and the school to prison pipeline, it starts to bleed into the area that working group has been looking at. Another point I would make just from a staff standpoint is that in consultation with the staff leads and the co-chairs, one of the issues that the co-chairs are pretty interested in supporting is the idea of supporting social workers, counselors, psychologists in schools to prevent issues from rising to the level where an SRO would need to become involved. So that's something that the group has highlighted, but I think it's also would be very well received by the co-chairs. So I think that's a good direction. The one thing that's come out in the discussion today that I think wasn't really clearly on my radar screen as a possible recommendation for this group is what Chief Letney talked about in terms of the selection process for SROs, that it would not just be the best and the brightest officers, but also officers who want to be there and who went through a process where the school system and the community had some input on selection. I think that Jackie Green may have talked a bit about the selection of school resource officers, but it will be helpful to get a little bit better sense of the group's reaction to that possible recommendation so that we can have some guidance on whether that's something that the group supports and we should work on, or whether it's something that doesn't rise to that level of needing to codify it.
Thank you, Jeff. Is Jasmine still with us?
I am. The only thing I would add, I'd flag, of course, that working group 1 is looking at the training issues. And so while I don't think they'll go into the weeds of exactly what the training, the details of what that training might be, they certainly will say something about the training of SROs. The co-chairs have been clear that you all should wrestle with the issues that you think you should wrestle with, and we will try to continue to watch out for and flag overlap. But it's also okay if working groups want to bring recommendations that are related areas to the task force for full vote, and then we as a staff will work to combine to make the report as concise as possible. So you all should continue wrestling with the issues, but I agree with Jeff in terms of where the scope, the bleeding is a little bit more pronounced.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. Greg, anything we missed in that area that from your perspective?
I don't have anything else to add. Thank you, Secretary.
All right. Now, as we start to close in on our time frame, I do want to again open it up, particularly if you don't think that you have been able to be heard in this discussion, if there's some substantive recommendation that you may have to be brought to the table, I invite you to do so now for the working group members.
This is Tally Wells. I'll just say, with respect to hearing a little bit about the interest of the co-chairs on social workers and others within the schools, one of the obvious questions is, well, how are you going to get that paid for? And I've started conversations just because I'm semi part of DHHS, just around funding for school-based behavioral health, which is and is not the same thing, but ultimately it really is. We're talking about the same people, because social workers tend to be used a lot in school-based behavioral health. And I worry about going too far afield. At the same time, if you don't have some funding source, you're not going to get anywhere. So it's something that I want to explore at least a little bit more, as to what opportunities there are for some of this funding for sort of social workers and alternative to SROs, and to supplement SROs, to deal with crises of students, because I think it's all basically the same thing. And the last thing I'll say is, Sergeant Gardens had me thinking about training, and one of the things I would hear from school resource officers in Atlanta, which I think is the same here, is that there is pressure from principals and from victims' families for something to be done. And a lot of times that, folks think about law enforcement, that it means, having the child arrested or sent over to juvenile courts or whatever. And so I think within the training is also just sort of more and more open thinking about just sort of diversion and other things that can be available that sort of respond to whatever happened, but in a productive way, as opposed to what may or may not be productive in terms of just a law enforcement criminal justice response.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly, that diversion is key to this, because ultimately we're looking to modify behavior. So school-based services are important, but even if there is a situation that an officer has to engage in, it's a violation of law, that officer should have some options. And if the officer doesn't have options, then the court should have options. And the more that we divert, certainly in the first instance, the second, and so on, and try to modify that behavior, the better we're going to serve that student, that family, that school system. When it comes to funding, I don't know if the states like Wake County, but I can tell you Wake County provides funding for SROs, only what the state provides them, which is about $36,000 a year for the first high school-based SRO. They will agree to some security money to the amount of about $21,000 a year for the second high school SRO, and they really want to for high school, but that's it. That's all they fund. So the rest of that fund, and $36,000 is not even the starting salary of an officer, let alone the salary of an officer that has experience, that has been here for a number of years, that we want to serve rather than hiring somebody new. So it does not fund the program whatsoever. Most agencies provide a significant amount additionally out of their budget for staffing, for vehicles, for equipment, for training, on and on and on and on, which gives at least some sense of strong support from those governing boards, be that the city council, the county commission, the county school board, wherever it is, that they are willing to invest in this program because it has value, and it is well beyond the value that the state already provides, funding wise anyway.
Thank you, Chief. We are just a few minutes away from the top of the hour at 4 o'clock. And so what I will provide some guidance to our substantive staff leads based on what I have heard from the group. They really kind of focused, and we're already kind of captured in our agenda, which is good. And they can be further developed by the discussions if they would craft the recommendations concerning what we have heard today. I do think that there is wide support for the enhancement or support of school justice partnerships, the data collection, and I know that we have to settle on exactly what we're collecting and how we collect it as well, and then the enhanced training and support for those school systems that and jurisdictions that elect to have school resource officers as well, as long as it focuses on the appropriate role of the SRO. So if we could craft some recommendations in those areas and circulate that to the group so that we can come back and have the consensus and voting discussions on, at the appropriate time in our next meeting. I think we have made a lot of progress. I hope this format has been good for you all. I still look up and say, where has the time gone? And I'm somebody who's very pressed for time all the time, just because of the dynamics of things that we all have to deal with. But it's time well spent, and I hope this format has been of a benefit to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.